Hi, welcome back. Because of some time issues, I might not get through the whole of this presentation. Nonetheless, I wanted to begin with a couple of poems. I thought we would kind of relax into this, and when I'm teaching constructive theology, I tend to begin each class with a poem. I talk about poetry as a prelude to prayer, and I'm using two poems here that mean a great deal to me. The first is perhaps one of the most famous poems of Seamus Heaney, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. You might know something of him. I find his poem called Digging, which is, again, it's an early poem, but it's also one that he's very well known for. And I find that it's very helpful in talking to students about what they'll be doing in theology. It also expresses some of my own kind of experience of tension and change in my own development. In this talk, which is The Virtues of a Questionable Faith, I do speak a bit more autobiographically, and the different kind of moves that I've been moved through. So it's at least, well, I think what I might do is use the Seamus Heaney poem at the beginning, and perhaps the Mary Oliver poem at the end. So here we go. Digging. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound. When the spade sinks into gravelly ground, my father digging, I look down, till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low and comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. I love this poem because it deals with such a tension of the creativity of the poet who knows he is different from his family, but who still wants to claim a connection to this tradition of the land, this love of his family, even as he knows he has no spade to follow men like them, even though he knows that his trajectory as a poet will be different. And the very first lines of that poem where he says, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Heaney is writing at a time when there is real political turmoil in Ireland, and he's being encouraged to be more of a radical poet. And he knows that words can do real damage, that words can be the beginnings, the act of violence. And against that, he thinks about his father, and there's a certain sense of shame. I think, my father digging, I look down till his straining rump appears among the flower beds. There's a tendency in the poet, in Heaney, to be ashamed of his past, to be ashamed of his farming parents. But instead, he turns that into a kind of bragging. When my grandfather dug more turf on a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Right? There's a kind of a participation in bragging about that tradition. Even as he's then going to come back and talk about the realism of the smell of mold, potato mold. But at the heart of doing constructive theology is a tension between connecting tradition to newness, to claiming one's own voice, to recognizing that the tradition, as much as one engages it, is not one's own voice. One has to move, one has to change. So this is a tension in my own life. So given this kind of introduction, this kind of poetic piece, let me just go ahead and get started. I want to say at the outset, so we can leave this here for now, and then we'll pick up the second poem later. I want to say at the outset that we all have different journeys of faith, spiritual journeys. And by sharing something of my own, I hope you'll be imagining moments and transitions in your own understanding and your commitments. And your journey might be just almost the opposite of mine in terms of where it moves and where it's taken you. Here we go. Into the 1950s, most Christian denominations of various stripes would agree on a common conviction that they were trying to bring the world to Christ. And this assumption went hand in glove with the colonial imperial aspirations of Western powers. Right? Certainly throughout the period in terms of World War I, which began to break some of that imperial language open. Certainly the end of World War II, when major European powers, including but also the United States, could no longer afford the colonial connections or supporting them. And those Western colonial assumptions began to break down in the wake of World War I, World War II. Langdon Gilkey, one of my teachers among others, when he was in the late 1950s and early 60s, and this included folks who were interested in the new quest at that time for the historical Jesus, they began realizing that something was amiss with the supernatural assumptions of that otherworldly theology. Philosophical existentialism had sounded the alarm, and theologians like Paul Tillich worked at reframing theology in ontological rather than supernatural terms. Ontological being a unified theory of being rather than a two-tiered language of the natural and then the supernatural. But there was also growing suspicion that Christian confidence in bringing salvation to the world was a mistake, and one linked to those Western colonial interests. The Holocaust, or Shoah, revealed the roots of Christian anti-Jewishness as enabling Hitler's final solution. The knowledge and use of nuclear weapons made us aware that the end of the earth might lay more in our hands than in God's. The civil rights movement in the United States called attention to how Christians had supported slavery and segregation. Even as black Christians were risking their lives for freedom in the civil rights movement. Women were beginning to realize that their own voices had been silenced, in part to Christian doctrines of God the Almighty Father and a Savior Son. And in former colonies all around the world, religious traditions and movements had been suppressed by Christian colonizers, and those voices began to reemerge. I was born into that world around 1956. As I was thinking about this talk, I remembered, for some of you at the last one, you're going to hear a repetition. I remembered a sermon that famous process theologian John Cobb delivered when he came to Phillips Theological Seminary about 8 to 10 years ago. I think he was 90 at the time, and I was astounded by his remarks. Because in the sermon, he spoke not of his significant achievements in process theology. Instead, he spoke confessionally of moments in his own professional life using the image of Acts 9, where the scales fell from his eyes and his sight was transformed. In those moments, he was turned around. In the sermon, he speaks of how he came to see the profound sinfulness of Christian anti-Jewishness, of Christian hatred of women or misogyny, of Christian participation in the abuse of the earth, and Christian oppression of GLBTQI persons. And as he told each of those stories, we saw him coming to terms with that blindness as well as the transformation of his voice, now as a significant advocate of those issues. And I turn to Cobb's sermon because his confession reminds me of my own journey as a white male theologian, coming to grips with others' voices I'd not paid attention to, including the voice of the earth itself. I think Cobb's confession asked me to embrace a new kind of humility, an acknowledgement that my own privileged view is not the center, is not the norm, but that it is, in David Tracy's words, part of a wider conversation that demands more listening of me than speaking. Although this weekend it's hard to doubt that I'm speaking quite a bit. And so my title, The Virtues of a Questionable Faith, is an attempt to situate my own moments of growth as a person and a growing theologian as a process in which I have found myself called to move beyond the boundaries of the more sure and certain faith in which I was raised into more questionable areas, because that's how people from that more secure or more traditional view will view me. They will view me as more questionable as I go. A faith that questions faith, and a faith, therefore, which can seem very questionable to others. And yet I have come to believe that we must keep leaving home. We must keep leaving the yard, if you'll remember my talk from last night. We have to keep leaving the yard that we have come to know and to risk our lives and our faith in ever-widening circles that will change us. I have difficulty separating my personal faith from my theological journey, precisely because my theological journey has been wedded deeply to my own experience and understanding of faith. My faith has been nurtured by books as part of my own experience, and the widely varying perspectives of those books have changed my own imagination and convictions. Without the books and many writers and teachers who have entered my life, I would not have grown in the same way. The processes of education, a marvelous education, have been vital to my own life, and I have become convinced that strengthening public commitments to education all the way down the line is absolutely central to a progressive faith. Without education, we might not grow in wonder and in curiosity. We might not grow in imagination or empathy. We might never learn the patience of conversation on difficult issues. So I want to begin by sharing a few stories from my childhood into young adulthood in order to show how I began to move from the faith of my childhood to something of a wider world opened by my teachers. In the interest of time, I might curtail that just a bit. As I say to my largely Protestant students when I begin my class in constructive theology, my parents didn't want me hanging out with the likes of you. For the very best of reasons, to guide me in the way of the true faith. My very religious Catholic parents wanted me to have good Catholic friends. We went, of course, to Catholic schools to be nurtured in a faith that God would sustain us and that would help hold our family together in good times and in bad. My parents' plan of protection, which notice is such a powerful and important impulse in parenting, that began to be challenged from the inside out, as it were, because my Catholic nuns and teachers and priests, as opposed to my parents and my older siblings, had been deeply influenced, and happily so, by the new teaching of Vatican II, which sought to open up the church to the modern world. It was convened in 1959, so there I was when I was 3 years old. By 1964 and 1965, it was beginning to publish its documents, and those documents were suggesting an openness to the world. We weren't going to do the Mass in Latin anymore. We were going to do it in the vernacular language. There was a real interest in terms of some social justice work. And this was invigorating my teachers. My parents and even older siblings had grown up in a much more traditional church. Neither of my parents had finished college. They had been teenagers and young adults through the Depression and through the war. They met in Denver and married during the war. They knew the necessity of hard work. As parents, they believed in strict discipline. They spanked my older siblings. I think they were worn out by the time they got to me. I remember overhearing their conversations with church friends over the years in which they lamented the increase of permissive child rearing. And they lamented as well the 1964 Supreme Court decisions outlawing, as they put it, teacher-led prayer and Bible reading in public schools. To be sure, we were not going to public schools, but Dad and Mom saw this as a worrying trend that God was not being listened to in our world. In grade school, however, I had Catholic teachers who, thanks to Vatican II, were able to talk about faith in relation to public and political life, not just with respect to the election of the first U.S. Catholic president in 1960, but also with respect to civil rights, celebrating the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who had received the Nobel Prize in 1964. My teachers developed exchange programs for the first time between our completely white suburban Catholic and more inner-city black Catholic congregations. They wanted to nurture cross-racial friendships, and I enjoyed those experiences, but my parents were more reserved. Issues of race were difficult for them to sort out. And they didn't think of race as a religious issue, but as a political one. Right? My teachers began to open an imaginative leap for me. Faith was not just about eternal life, but about issues of justice in this life. I'm going to skip this next story that involved about high school. Right? And then in the midst of my college years, I again encountered then the new quest for the historical Jesus, as that was showing up in some campus work. The new quest, with its emphasis on Jesus' humanity and location amidst the poor, helped not just some of my other teachers, but feminist and liberation theologians argue for the importance of understanding what theologian Ann Carr described as a God who is involved in social and political transformation. Because here the emphasis was on Jesus' humanity and not simply on his divinity. The emphasis on the humanity of Jesus in the midst of the poor, in the midst of resistance to the Roman Empire, provided a sense of real empowerment and theological calls for the transformation of society. This process of opening up my embedded faith in that more traditional model to the more human world would lead me to a study and embrace of political and feminist and liberationist voices. And later, when I was at Harvard, GLBTQI theologies. With each of those theologies by Catholics and Protestants and Jewish authors and humanist authors, I was leaving the yard of a more conservative faith. In my studies at Northwestern University in rhetorical criticism, at Harvard Divinity School in courses on Paul and the historical Jesus with Dieter Georgi, at the University of Chicago in studies of hermeneutics with David Tracy, I was also being equipped to better understand, but also to question, Christian traditions more pointedly. In those studies of rhetoric and hermeneutics, I was learning both the importance and the methods for reinterpreting our Western faith traditions into a contemporary discourse concerned about this world, socially, politically, scientifically, economically. And these voices of political and ecological theology pressed me further, for now the domains of the religious and the political were coming to meet in prophetic calls for liberation and justice. By the time of my doctoral studies, I no longer understood myself as a Catholic, but as a kind of progressive Catholic-Protestant mix. I didn't think I needed to disown the journey that had itself changed me, but I found myself at profound odds with the Church's teaching on sexuality, on its failure to ordain women, and of course with the Church's own inability to confront its historic history of sexual abuse of children. I cannot tell you how important a moment it is that Cardinal Pell is standing trial in Australia. It's a powerful message, an important one. And notice what is developing in these feminist and womanist and liberationist and post-colonial theologies. They are not simply reinterpreting Christian tradition into our cultural context. They're also willing to identify elements of Christian tradition, including God, as the problem. And by problem here, I mean the association with the topic of sin, which contemporary theology now needs to address and critique. For example, a Canadian theologian, very middle-of-the-road theologian in the Neo-Orthodox tradition, Douglas John Hall, identifies Christianity's tendency to triumphalism as a central problem that contemporary theology needs to reject. One thinks of feminist theologies criticizing the maleness of God, Mary Daly's biting critique, as long as God's a male, all males are gods, and the reinterpretation of God in Sally McFague's work as mother, lover, and friend. I think of James Cone's assailing the whiteness of God as authorizing slavery and insisting instead that God is black. And so I was beginning to see how deeply symbolic the language of God was, how it was not politically innocent, but politically loaded, authorizing power over others. And so much of my life as a professor of theology has been spent observing and teaching about the implications of this knowledge for faith. How does it challenge us? How does it open us? To what does it call us? Of how this knowledge calls us to keep leaving the safety of our own yards. The importance of leaving our embedded theologies and opening up to a wider discourse. Imagining others' lives, women's lives, colonized lives, enslaved lives, politically and economically abused lives, governed, as it were, by white, male, Christian authorities. When one's dealing with that kind of literature, it's difficult not to feel a powerful call to repent, to try to turn away from that. The liberationist and feminist language of systemic sin rather than original sin proved helpful to me. Systems that silenced them, that silenced their education, their career goals, that fostered an internalized sense of shame, of being less than, of being not equal to. Well, those same systems structured privileges for me that encouraged a gendered and a cultured sense of superiority. And the assumptions that these structures and systems were authorized and blessed by God. It wasn't pleasant to look at this. And there is that sense of scales falling from my eyes as I began to acknowledge my responsibility for how to speak of God, for how I speak of God or not. I think as well of Gordon Kaufman's work on theology in a nuclear age, in which he argued it was irresponsible of theologians and church officials to speak of the omnipotence of God when we had the capacity to end life on this planet in our hands. That assertion of divine power is not simply naive, according to Kaufman, but irresponsible. To be sure, most of these theological movements, liberationist and feminist and ecological theologies, were not setting God aside, but they're powerful reinterpretations of God, which authorized their proposals for real changes in theology and religious and political life, raised an awareness of our responsibility for how we speak of God. So I'm now a long way from home. And from the perspective of those who have not made this journey, my faith can seem quite questionable. I wrote my book, A Scandalous Jesus, How Three Historic Quests Changed Theology for the Better, in this awareness. And with my discussions of each of the three quests, the 19th century quest, the new quest in the mid-20th century, and the Jesus Seminar, I showed how theologians used the topic of the historical Jesus to leverage transformations in both church and society. In other words, biblical scholars and theologians were using the topic of the historical Jesus to call both the church and society to open their eyes to new cultural situations and to new realities. Each quest called for the rethinking of Christian doctrine in order to open up the church to wider intellectual and moral conversations, vis-a-vis science, vis-a-vis democracy, vis-a-vis other religions. And I was particularly moved in my work with Westar, the Jesus Seminar, by the creative focus on the destabilizing character of Jesus' parables. The turn to language in the focus of the Jesus Seminar would prove to be another shift, drawing me out yet again. In this next paragraph, I think I'll just kind of summarize this briefly. I list a whole series of kind of philosophical voices that dealing with language and hermeneutics that were really then also quite important to me. Let me try to see if I can summarize this here. Influenced by Martin Heidegger's later more explicit language shift to the study of language, as epitomized in his famous phrase, "Language is the house of being." I was also then quite moved by Jacques Derrida's phrase, "There is nothing outside the text," which pointed anew to the constructed character of human knowledge, and hence the need to deconstruct the pretensions of philosophies and theologies that claim to know or have access to a founding presence outside of language. Let me just say a bit more on that. That can be dizzying. Derrida was interested in the work of a linguist, Fernand de Saussure, who died in the early 20th century. And it was Saussure who argued that in the study of language, right, human language is not transparent to reality. Right? We often think of the word tree points to the word tree, or the word podium points to the word podium. No. So Saussure said, that's not how language works. About language, the signs are arbitrary. What we learn to distinguish as speakers is the way in which tree is different than thee, is different than be, is different than... We learn to make distinctions, and we learn this as part of what it means to come to language. But language itself, the signs themselves are not transparent. They never get you to a pure presence. They never get you to a pure sense of essence. So you're always within language. You never get beyond language. And this, of course, then, is quite important then for thinking about theology, which likes to talk about the pure presence of God, which wants to talk about the pure essence of God. And Derrida says, in the nature of language, this is simply impossible. And Derrida's had some real influence in contemporary theology that I'll now point to and probably conclude with that. Recently, I found the work of John Caputo, who I've gotten to know through Westar's God Seminar, to be particularly helpful to me in thinking about Derrida's notion of uncertainty. Instead of Plato's notion that we started with this morning in terms of you try to get to that basis of certainty, and Derrida saying you never can do it. The nature of language means you never get to a point of pure presence or certainty, and therefore what that opens up is a discourse of uncertainty. Uncertainty is a presupposition for our current understanding and practice of faith, that there is no pure speech that occurs apart from context, apart from the interests and cultural systems, and thus no getting back to a sure presence or of an origin or an absolute beginning. This can be a deeply destabilizing and disturbing thought, and that is what it needs to be according to Caputo and according to Derrida, because undoing our ideologies of certainty, especially ones grounded in an all-powerful God, deconstructing the premise of presence, can reopen our capacity to respond to others in far more generous and just ways. Instead of focusing on origin, Caputo asks us to focus on our experience of events that are unexpected, that interrupt and break open our cultural sense of everydayness, our conventionalness. Such events which can appear as both threatening and life-giving, and often simultaneously so, awaken us from our own slumber in everydayness, as well as remind us of our capacity to respond to life, awakening the responsibility that lies at the heart of all human life, calling forth our courage to be with and for others, as well as for ourselves. Not with the certainty of presence, no, but with the certainty, as it were, of risk, right? Such events can be personally life-changing: the birth of a child, a marriage or divorce, one's own experience of a great teacher, the risk of one's life for another, or the moment of experiencing another's heroism or fear of life. They might also be moments in the life of a culture, like the civil rights movement, the profound discoveries of space, 9/11, deep economic recession, that both threaten and inspire our participation in life. It's uncertainty all the way down. But such moments, such events in both their threatening and promising character, illuminate our human tendencies to seek safety on the one hand and to embrace the danger on the other. For Caputo, such events, especially what he will call the event of God, and the profound suffering and tears and prayers that accompany it, call forth, in Paul Tillich's phrase, the courage to be. That is the risk of faith in the midst of uncertainty. Caputo writes, I pray the God who exposes me to trouble to rid me of the God who keeps me safe, who functions as a guarantor of tranquility and order. Wow, that's different. What does he mean by praying such a prayer? In his prayer to be rid of the God who keeps me safe and who functions as a guarantor of tranquility and order, Caputo begins to sketch the contours of the problem. To the eyes of more traditional confessional faith, his prayer seems ridiculous. Don't we pray that God will keep us safe when we are in danger? Isn't that precisely when we need to feel God's presence? Yet Caputo pushes the question, what kind of God is it who promises to keep me safe? And what is it that God asks of me in order to keep me safe? Do I keep silent? Right? What's the deal? The real problem with this confessional model of God, according to Caputo, is that it trades in claims of certainty and therefore promises what it cannot deliver. From countless experiences amidst our lives and observing others' lives, we see that the most ardent prayer does not prevent us or others from suffering. The model of God as a supernatural being who protects on the one hand and threatens on the other is not a just one, says Caputo. Believe in the doctrine as it is told to you. That's the deal. Don't question it. The problem with this model of God and this model of faith is that it teaches us to hide from life, according to Caputo, to be suspicious of others who are different, to hide out not only from them but also from ourselves. And are there moments in life to be concerned about our safety? Of course, but that should not be a way of life. And too often, faith understood as belief in this supernatural being, says Caputo, leads exactly to that place. For Caputo, God understood as a being or as the ground or the source of being, as the stabilizer of being, does not exist. Rather, he says, God insists. Writing in his 2015 book, Hope Against Hope, Caputo says that the insistence of God means that the name of God is the name of something that lays claim to us unconditionally, like a promise of things that eye has not seen nor ears heard, but without the force of being, of power, of sovereignty, and omnipotence. In other words, there is a sense of call, but not a caller, not someone not a person, as it were, or a supreme being. It means that something calls upon us unconditionally, but without the power of an economic system of rewards or retributions, or an army without even a heavenly host of angels to back it up. More interesting, the existence of God, fought over in the 19th century. Does God exist? Does God not exist? Says Caputo, the question of what work is getting done under the name of God, that's the issue. And I find his insight helpful here. What work is getting done in the feminist discussion of God, or the liberationist, or the post-colonial? Why are they discussing God in that way? What are they really proposing? What are they calling us towards? God's existence, according to Caputo, is up to us. Existing is what we do. Making God's insistence real in the world is up to us, if we are listening. While acknowledging with Derrida that language does not get us to the ground of being, to a point of absolute stabilization and certainty, Caputo is clearly not done wrestling with God in his own work. In his book, The Weakness of God, he says, what Derrida means by justice is what I mean by God. There is an insistent character to justice, an unconditional character that from age to age calls, that persists. And yet that call for justice does not necessarily have a caller behind it. But it persists in the way it questions us and calls us to respond, to establish a more just world. Caputo's thought is quite nuanced here. But even in the midst of faith, he wants to press us to let go of certainty, to let go of the promises of confessional faith, which inevitably, he thinks, shrinks our world and our responsibility for it. Letting go of certainty, he says, is crucial to enabling our capacity to be more open and responsive to differences. If we can let go of certainty and the way in which then all of our lives are structured within certain kinds of certain claims, we might be able to let go of the sureness of our superiority, of our privilege, our racial and gender superiority. We might let go of some of our judgmentalism towards others. We might have a more open mind when thinking about ecological or economic or political issues. Uncertainty for Caputo is not only a domain of intellectual honesty, but a domain of both courage and hope for the sake of justice. Caputo's language helps me to let go of God, to let go of God's existence without also letting go of the importance of God as an ongoing topic, as an ongoing challenge, not just for thought, but for reality. But also then to let go of my attempt to grasp, to name, to speak authoritatively about the reality of God or not. The edge of the call calls me to decenter myself, not to die, but to live, to perhaps live a bit more openly in the midst of uncertainty, to keep breaking out of the enclosures of fears that bind me. Hearing in that calling the call to let go of God, to not hold on to God as an authorizing voice that would stabilize and anchor me, I experience something of an apophatic faith, one that can engage the mystics perhaps in a new way, a faith of unknowing, a faith of questioning, a moving faith. Once again, I find myself leaving home, but perhaps in a way that's also approaching a different kind of home. I think I want to stop there and maybe we'll pick up this last poem by Mary Oliver. Because in this poem, we can hear some of the Platonic language we were discussing this morning, but also the way in which she kind of plays that out in a very different key. The Spirit likes to dress up like this: 10 fingers, 10 toes, shoulders, and all the rest. At night in the black branches, in the morning in the blue branches of the world. It could float, of course, but would rather plumb rough matter. Airy and shapeless thing, it needs the metaphor of the body, lime and appetite, the oceanic fluids. It needs the body's world, instinct and imagination, and the dark hug of time, sweetness and tangibility to be understood. To be more than pure light that burns where no one is. So it enters us in the morning, shines from brute comfort like a stitch of lightning. And at night, lights up the deep and wondrous drownings of the body like a star. Here you can still hear the language of spirit and flesh, but which one is now privileged? The desire of spirit to take flesh, to take body. Again, in this poem, we hear a transformation of theology from a preoccupation with the eternal, with spirit, over the last 60 years, and see it turning to the world, towards issues of justice, towards issues of embodiment. And that's also where Mary Oliver's poem leads us, to return us to the full goodness of being embodied and the delight that the Spirit takes in taking on that sense of flesh. Thanks very much.
thank you for that wonderful personal sharing that you just gave us.
Thank you.
In the context, I guess, for some of us, and as I was sharing with my younger colleague here, the grey hair amongst us,
Yeah, right.
have been on that journey. But I was really intrigued about language and wanted your feedback, I guess, or comment on, somebody once said words are notoriously treacherous. I don't know who it was, but
Yes.
I often hang on to that. And I guess my question is that as we journey, I'm talking about time now,
Yeah.
and experiential, because there are influences coming in. As we journey, when we stop sometimes, we can't actually find the language to express where we've
Yes.
come from. And a little bit like I was sharing with Rachel at the moment, we're on a 3-day hike, and we get to the middle of the second day, and somebody asks us how we feel, but we can't find the language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
So
Yeah.
my question is, as we go on that journey, the enlightenment comes, but no words are possible to explain what that is.
Mm-hmm. I definitely, I mean, I concur in the experience that there are times when there are no words, when we are in some ways between languages, when in terms of this morning's lecture, we're between worldviews, when something isn't yet settled, and so our language is ambiguous. Perhaps even then it's more important than otherwise to pay attention to poets, to pay attention to those voices who really are so sensitive, oftentimes, and more sensitive certainly in the poets I love, and Claire was just telling me a few other poets that might be very helpful. So where our own kind of learning sometimes is stalled, but where, again, we need to stay the course. Earlier I quoted a Merton reflection in which he said, we sometimes, many modern people, confront in our own sense a question that we're not sure about God. And he says, what's really important is not to regress. What's really important is not to simply try to go back to what we learned in the first grade or something, or in my sense, to go back home, but really to stay with. Here I think of John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul, that one stays in that kind of liminal space, but now more intriguingly engaged with all of our senses, with all of our awareness open to receiving, right? Not a divine revelation, but a revelation of an avenue of language, and revelation of possibilities of connecting both with others, but also with this kind of journey we're on. So and certainly for someone like Derrida would say, well, of course there's times when we don't have words. That doesn't mean that there's a pure presence, right, that we're connecting with. Derrida would say, when I talk about all of language as a system, I mean, I'm speaking in a theoretical sense, that even when we struggle for words, we still think in language. And so anyway, thank you.
You and I spoke very briefly over tea,
Yes.
and I think in both your talks today that I've heard, you have done a marvelous job of pulling us away from a false god or false belief. I don't think at this stage, although you covered it briefly as you ended, that gives any direction as to where we should go to find a replacement, a new possibility. Which leaves the responsibility to us, and I'm not uncomfortable with that. If Dr. Jason John is right on his numbers, about 37% of the Uniting Church still believes in in a different form of God, what, in a sense, the one that you were detaching us from.
Yeah.
I think that consigns us to doing a journey rather than going for a destination. And I'm not unhappy about that. I love the journey.
Yeah.
But I do think we need to work through and perhaps provide some direction into terms of what is the replacement.
Yeah.
In my own discovery, I worked through dealing with the false gods and false beliefs from about my mid-teens through to about age 25. And it took me a long time to figure out that there are some things within myself or within humanity that have given me real direction. One is there seems to be an ability to love that is not satisfied unless I pursue it. And the golden rule that you should love your neighbor seems to be common to almost all religions. But yes, I'm feeling a lack of where to go from here once you have destroyed all the previous beliefs.
Well, I hope I haven't destroyed all the previous beliefs, but I hope that I've helped us understand them. And I hope that I've helped us understand that kind of all theological models are embedded in cultural contexts, and that clearly in the 20th and 21st century, the pace of change is moving us far more dramatically than anything in the Middle Ages or in the classical period, where knowledge was relatively stable and accessed only by the few. When one thinks of what is happening on the World Wide Web in terms of sharing and engaging and questioning, it's like, oh my goodness. I mean, there's no way even the modern period understood this kind of cacophonous discourse and the challenges it raises to every worldview. So I think on the one hand, we have to kind of, on the one hand, we really do, as religious communities, need to begin to talk about theology. We need to talk about worldviews and shifting worldviews. We need to talk about our responsibility for claiming a discourse. And so in that sense, there are some moves in the 20th century, for example, that still might be helpful. For example, the development of process theology, the way in which I love Catherine Keller's book, for example, Face of the Deep, in which she really explores, again, a kind of a panentheistic theology that really moves with the sense of the chaotic, and that embraces Derrida's language of uncertainty, but also a sense of somehow in the mystery of God that there is a presence here. Presence might be too strong a word given Derrida, but still a kind of a dynamic and a process that orients us increasingly to life. I'm thinking too of Lloyd Gearing's insight when he says, no one at the beginning of the 20th century could have predicted what we would come to by the end of the 20th century in terms of innovations, cultural conflicts, etc. And I think that's true as we look at the 21st century, that we cannot really anticipate the dramatic changes. What we can begin to try to do is to try to begin to appreciate differences, even as we try to hold to something of what we might call or orient to as a kind of a main kind of direction. And so in that sense, as you can see in my third kind of move in this paper, I do think that Caputo's language, and even language that shows up in Greta Vosper's language, she's not as explicit philosophically about it, but she keeps talking about a call, and that there is a call. And I'm thinking here again of Don Cupid's, back as this, I think his 1981 book, Taking Leave of God, where he's still talking, he was holding on more to Kant's sense of the ethical imperative, which I think is your sense of love your neighbor, that there's a kind of imperative that seems to be, and I would say evolutionarily it might be connected to our need for community, that in fact we need difference in order to be oriented to the world. But when I think of Lloyd Gearing's work, and this is important then for science, when theologians who want to engage science as a way of getting our attention for climate change, for example, right, our moral responsibility, notice that they don't simply quote science and the data of scientific material. Theologically, you've got to transform that sense of science into a sense of wonder of the world. And that sense of wonder of the world, whether you're Lloyd Geering or Catherine Keller, ends up saying, we're at home here. That's the way in which they're reframing that language of science, of wonder at the heavenly bodies and all of this. Text after text, you can write me and tell me when you find a different one, but the basic ethos is to say, we're trying to re-understand the story of creation and of this world as our home. And that's crucial to the development of theology, I think, in the next generation. That we begin increasingly to say, whatever it is that we mean by God, whatever we mean, and I think there's important things for me in the historical Jesus or in the parables, is opening up a sense of sacred discourse. Whatever we mean there, it has to open up into a world not of certainty, but a play of virtue, of values, of how we hold together the integrity of people against economic challenge, against racial challenges, against all the different discourses that want to diminish and demean. The language of the sacred here, beginning with the earth itself, is to lift this up and to say in no uncertain terms, our identity, our worth is intertwined with others and with the otherness of the earth. There is a sacred story here that is unfolding. Christian insights are not irrelevant to this, but nor are Christian insights the only ones that matter. And so this is something that we really have to begin to take on, which is one of the places in my last talk, I'll talk about one of the real creative places in theology, is the interaction of world religions. And how once people even more increasingly intermarry across these religious traditions, become embedded in one another, we're going to have some even more fascinating theologies about the interreligious. Ones that will disorient us if we read them today, but they will become more important. So yes, I think we're in for a time of increasing diversity, and where the sacred calls us to respect that and to hold together a world that in many ways wants to fall apart.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to kind of chime in a bit on the same theme. In parenthesis, part of my background's philosophy, so I've read a lot of Derrida in my past.
Oh my goodness, good.
For our purposes, I find a useful reference point I find is, talk about the image of God, the phrase God the Father, for example. For some people evokes a very harmful and distressing experience and is absolutely disinviting to awareness of the presence of God or community in church, etc., etc.
Yes.
For others, it's actually evokes a kind of a sense of nurturing and comfort. And when I look at Derrida, I see the same possibilities in the language. The language of no presence and uncertainty can also invite disorientation and loss and falling apart, and it can also invite a kind of a creative regeneration. Yes. And for me, it really matters a lot to explicitly name the various possible relations between the language we use and the experiential processes that that language is inviting in the lived experience of the people we're with, time to time. And I personally would not place language at the centre. For me, in relation to spiritual traditions, I'm practice first, and I'm consequently happy moving between multiple traditions. And then the language, I experience language as speaking from experiencing, not at the core, but obviously valuably enabling as an explication. And a way to point beyond Derrida here is to think the evolutionary journey and think how more primal embodiment is as compared to language. So I think there's clearly good reasons for looking beyond the boundaries of what language is able to do and not able to do within the context of this kind of revisioning of who we are collectively.
Right.
And so it's a kind of comment, obviously.
No, thank you. I mean, I think I'll, for the most part, just let that stand. But I think you're right. The tension between embodiment and discourse. On the one hand, one Derrida, I can imagine, or others saying, well, but even here, we're always thinking even about embodiment within the discourse of language. On the other hand, the claim of embodiment is a profound one. And so, thank you. I think you're...
Before we go, sorry, Ron, just before we go, was there anybody whose gender is other than male who would like to ask a question just before? I just want to give a little space. Okay, we are, so certainly.
Thank you for today's continuing journey.
Thank you.
The claim to embodiment, that's my segue.
Good.
Sharing Mary Oliver's poem, The Spirit Likes to Dress Up.
Yeah.
I think I got your glimpse of spirit longing, yearning for flesh. Could you talk a little bit to that?
Well, what I love about the poem is for those of us who really, and I'm one of them, who experience this tension, certainly in my own life and my own childhood, but then also as I became a student in theology, about a more classical tradition that really was suspicious of the flesh, right? The flesh was something you had to be on high alert over, and preferred oftentimes virginity, and didn't really know how to deal with sex. It's like St. Augustine said, you should have sex, but you shouldn't enjoy it. And it's like, well, what does that mean? But anyway, you have this deep suspicion of the flesh in classical theology, and then this movement, in part by virtue of affirming the goodness of human people and of human bodies, you begin to see this turn towards the world and therefore towards the flesh. Over the last 60 or so years in theology, and therefore the particularities of women, the particularities of GLBTQI, the particularities of suffering bodies in terms of injustice. And so at that sense, one can try to too easily split those. So what I love about Mary Oliver's poem is that she holds them together. She wants to say that spirit is not a discourse we should let go of, right? But also there's a playfulness in this that says the spirit likes to dress up, right? So there's this deep affirmation of flesh and body that by the time you get to the end of the poem, right, spirit and flesh are again reconnected, but now with an emphasis towards the body, with an emphasis towards the sense that bodies really matter. And so that's what I love about the poem, what I love about what it calls us to do and to care about. And not simply to split spirit off and say, spirit gives me a rationale for why I don't have to attend to bodies. I mean, that's the problem for me, the ongoing problem for me with classical models of faith, is that spirit often gave you a reason to deny the body at so many important critical junctures. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Joe for that really stimulating session.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.